Hello and welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2022, brought to you with kind thanks to our Platinum supporters, Fable and Intopia, and our Gold supporters, UX for the Win, TPGI, and Barrier Break. A reminder that you can follow our Twitter account at ID24Conf. And if you have questions for our presenters at any time throughout the conference, please tweet us with the hashtag ID24, or the YouTube chat is open on each of the individual video pages too. I'm delighted to welcome the next of our co-hosts to join us, Roberto Scano. Roberto, over to you.
Okay, thank you. And next we have Marion Quenson talking about the user experience of accessibility checklist. Over to you, Marion.
Thanks, and happy to be here. Thank you for selecting me. I'm super happy to be here at this 10th edition of the Inclusive Design 24 conference. And hello, good morning, I would rather say, from Berlin. My name is Marion. I'm an accessibility designer, which I define as someone focusing on building accessible design through product and implementing accessible practices that scales at the size of companies. And I work for Futurists, which is a consultancy that provides expertise in strategy, design, engineering, and data. And this talk is inspired by my work with my project team, which is composed of 12 awesome designers willing to deliver the best to our clients. And at some point, it meant putting together an accessibility checklist. And for over a year and a half, I have been working with them and our client in order to improve this checklist. So what you'll learn today is what are accessibility checklists, why are they useful, how to implement them in your process, and what are their limits. So what are we talking about exactly? There's not a real definition I could find online, so I came up with my own, which is that accessibility checklists are tools to evaluate the extent to which an element meets your accessibility requirements. And nowadays, accessibility checklists seems to have become quite fashionable. You'll find various organizations publishing their accessibility checklists, including consultancies, product companies, and brand, individual, and open source projects, as well as government entities. I gathered only a couple of them on the slides. We can see the one from Vox Accessibility Media, the one from Intopia, that is funnily called the Accessibility Not Checklist, and some others, including the one from the A11Y project and the University of Birmingham. And with the spread of this checklist, we started to hear praise, but also criticism, like this one from Sherry Bernhaber, who is saying in her article, Accessibility Checklists Just Say No, general accessibility checklists containing all WCAG 2.1 level AA guideline should not be used and should never be used in an organization trying to achieve accessibility maturity. That's quite a statement, and we can wonder like why this criticism. From my point of view, it comes down to the how accessibility checklists are used. But before that, I would like to give some reason why I think accessibility checklists can be useful. The first one, the first opportunity I see is to build accessibility standards in your product. If we start from a compliance point of view, and that would be probably the best way to start if you're starting from scratch with accessibility, you would like to follow or to adapt your checklist from the WCAG. And the WCAG has in total 78 success criterion, 50 if we take only the AA and the A level of compliance. And it's a lot of information to memorize and integrate systematically in your workflow. So from a very practical point of view, checklists can help you to build those standards in your way of working. The second opportunity I see is to provide a way for designers to assess their designs. You might be aware that in the development field, there are automated tools that cover to a certain extent the issue that can appear in terms of accessibility. But this kind of tools are very limited for designers, and it kind of gives the feeling that the responsibility of designer is mostly about ensuring that the color contrast is enough, but there's a lot of things that can be addressed at the design stage, and checklists provide guidance to perform those manual checks, and they basically empower designer to solve accessibility issues before they arrive later in the process, where their fixing cost will increase significantly. About the cost of fixing accessibility checklists, I recommend checking the shift left model from DQ to learn more on this topic. The third opportunity I see is to transfer knowledge about accessibility to your teams. Many people in tech are not trained on accessibility and have little or basic knowledge of the topic. Learning to work with accessibility checklists can help them integrate accessibility standards in their practice, especially if they receive the support from accessibility experts. I'll tell more about this later. And the fourth opportunity is to track your progress with accessibility. Of course, it depends a lot, this opportunity, how the process around the checklist is working. You can track accessibility issues, but let's say that you could track accessibility issues and when they get solved, like at which stage, and that can already give you some information on your level of proficiency or reactivity with the topic. And if some issues never get solved, and maybe you can analyze why and find that there are some patterns, and maybe in the end this can also inform iteration from the checklist or any other practices you build around accessibility in your organization. Okay, so now I've been speaking about why I think accessibility checklists can be useful. Now I'm going to talk a bit more about the how. And it's the biggest part of this presentation. So I'm going step by step. And the first step is about adapting WCAG requirements. And this is a necessary step, actually, that you have to do. And to understand why, you can just take a look at one of the different success criterion you can find in the WCAG 2.1. I took this one, the 2.3.3, which states motion animation triggered by an interaction can be disabled unless the animation is essential to the functionality or the information being conveyed. It's 8 a.m. right now, so it's quite early, but still, even if I read this criterion at 4 p.m. today, I would still need to wrap my head around it because, yeah, it uses sometimes a bit technical wording, and the phrases are quite long, so you really need to focus to kind of get what it means. And that's why some sort of translation is, from my point of view, necessary to make it more actionable, to integrate in your workflow. But how people translate it is the interesting thing to see. So here is this example from the Webflow accessibility checklists that states avoid parallax effects. And this is coming from this criterion. So it might seem a bit restrictive way of translating the criterion, because it's basically, yeah, saying that you should avoid doing a certain practices, and yeah, for some designers, I think it's kind of something we have already seen in the field. They would feel like accessibility can be quite restrictive again about what you can do or what you can't do. And usually, I think this kind of conception comes from those accessibility checklists that are interpretation of the WCAG. But on the other hand, I understand that Webflow have been taking the time of reflecting, okay, how do we want to translate this success criterion? And in the end, they make the decision, this is how we're gonna put it. And I think it's perfectly fine that checklists are interpretation of the WCAG, as long as another company, you don't go to the Webflow accessibility checklist and say, okay, we also need an accessibility checklist, and copy it over without really taking the time of understanding where the requirements coming from. That's why my first tip here would be to always craft your checklist from the original WCAG success criteria. And yeah, it doesn't mean you can't get inspiration from other accessibility checklist when you do it, but just be aware, this is not the original success criterion. So yeah, you might create misinterpretation along the way if you use them as they are. And another thing that Webflow is actually doing in their checklist, and that I found super important as well, is to explain why your requirements matters. So for instance, for their avoid parallax effect, they are saying a parallax effect is a design trend where background elements move at different speeds than foreground elements while scrolling. So that's great because they're giving this kind of technical definition. And then they says, this type of motion is harmful to people with vestibular disorders and should be avoided and are used with extreme caution and restraint. So here you get a better idea why they came up with this recommendation. And in my experience, I've never seen a designer being against a requirement if they realize that this can be harmful to the user in the end. But maybe I am naive and I haven't met so many designers, but yeah, in general, people kind of understand and try to find solution that accommodates the user. Nevertheless, to make sure you avoid any misinterpretation and also give some freedom to your team to deal with your requirement, I would also always recommend to add the success criterion reference to your requirements so that people can further dig into the WCAG documentation and make the best decision for their case. Another example I want to give here is this example about the first success criterion, which states all non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative but serves the equivalent purpose except for the situations listed below. And the description goes on. I'm not going to go into the list of exceptions, but you get the idea. So here we see that this criterion covers several situations and use cases. And we're going to focus only on one cases, which is this one where you have an image that conveys meaning that is not translated into text. So what this criterion says is that we need a text alternative for it. And here I have 3 different accessibility checklists that or items from the checklist that covers this requirement with different wording. And we're gonna take a look at those different wording and what they entice or what they mean. One says images should have meaningful alternative text, which can seem very broad because it's basically not saying what is meaningful. And it also gives the feeling that all images should have a meaningful alternative text, while when you dig into the documentation, you realize that, yes, images, at least an HTML image tag, should have an empty alternative text if they are decorative, but if they bear meaning that is otherwise not carried within some text, then they need this meaningful text alternative. So this requirement in the end is kind of changing a little bit the meaning or the intent of the success criterion. The second example I'd like to give states image elements using the HTML tag have an alt attribute. Okay, this one is more focused on one technology, which is HTML. But it's still broad and it can be misinterpreted because at some point it also gives the feeling that all images should have an alt attribute. And it's also a bit restrictive in a sense that it gives the feeling that only image tag should have an alternative text, when we know that there are other cases for that. For instance, with SVG tags. And the third example, which I think is maybe the most complete example, is stating informative images have alt text, decorative images don't. So here I kind of like that it's really drawing this line and encouraging the people using the checklist to wonder, like, is this images informative or is it decorative? But it still can give the feeling that decorative images shouldn't have any alt text when they should have one that is empty. So from those three examples, you understand that wording matters tremendously when you're writing those requirements, because when you're crafting your checklist, you can broaden or limit the meaning of original WCAG success criteria. What this also means is that one criterion usually turns out into being several requirements. So here I have this example from This is WCAG checklist, and where we can see that for the first success criteria of the WCAG, there are several requirements that covers the different use case that you can have. Another thing that you can learn from this is that it's important to distinguish or to make the distinction between the criterion and how you adapt it. I think it's important to wonder in this case, what are the concrete to-dos that our team would need to do in order to accomplish or match this success criterion when you're creating the requirement. One example I can give for that is the IBM Equal Access Toolkit, which provides a useful example for each situation of their requirements that illustrate the requirements. So here we can see, for instance, that they have this what to do section where they explain how to, the process, so identify and annotate decorative images, and then provide alternative text for meaningful images, including logos and icons, ensure the alternative text describe the purpose, not the image, and provide both a short and a more detailed description for complex visual. And then you have these images where there is a decorative annotation that explain this situation where the where the image don't give any valuable information and must have a empty alternative text. So to summarize this part, I'd say this structure can be a good basis for your checklist because it has the requirements, the rationale, the example, what you expect from your team, what they should document or how they should document or annotate the design, and then the source, so which criterion it's coming from. Now let's talk about shaping the checklist, which is the second step. And here I will take this quote from one of my fellow designers, that I surveyed some months ago about the checklist, and they said to me, I feel overwhelmed with this endless table. Having everything on one page makes it difficult to focus on the relevant topics. So what we learn already from this is it's important to provide ways to filter the checklist so that people can directly access what they need. But how is the complexity here? So I'm gonna explore some ways that you can divide your checklist into. And the first one would be dividing by topic. Usually most checklists are divided by topic. I can give this example from the A11Y project, where they have this table of content that includes section like images, headings, lists, forms, controls, video, and so on and so on. And for each of those sections, you would have requirement listed and then you can disclose more information. So already like the information is kind of divided in a way that it helps to digest the information. But in our case as well, the checklist was already divided by topic, and yet we got this feedback. So it seemed that this way of dividing the information, even if it's necessary, it's not enough to properly reduce the cognitive load. Some other company or organization come up with a different way of dividing the checklist. I have this example from the Vox Media accessibility checklist, where they divide by role. So you would find categories like designers, engineers, project managers, QA, and editorial. And to be honest, I am a bit unsure about this approach for two reasons. First, even inside companies, roles can vary depending on the team a lot. So you would have team with certain roles that would have certain responsibilities, and then you can have other teams with the same roles and different responsibilities, or not the same role, and then because of that, the responsibility are shared differently. So that's kind of a challenge. And here I'm not even talking about having this outside of an organization. And the second reason is that when you do this, you take the risk to leave the responsibility or one of the responsibility of a requirement only to one role. And when I think actually each role should have received a piece of the responsibility. I can take an example for this last one, which is if you're dividing the requirement by role, who should take care of the alternative text? Should it be the content strategist? Should it be the designer? Should it be the developer? Vox Media kind of go beyond this problem in their checklist because they duplicate the requirement to the different role. But I think this can be even more tailored by role and by sharing also the responsibility a bit better. So one example for this specific requirement would be that you would have like one checklist for content strategist that could say when information is conveyed through image only, provide a short description of the information. For designer, there would be another checklist that says ensure that accessible names convey the information necessary to the user in a concise way, because designer would be more responsible of the experience of this. So they would focus more on this aspect specifically. And then developers could have something like implement all the accessible name documented. And this led me to this idea that actually we could also divide by process. I have never really seen that in a company, but I'm pretty sure it might exist in some corporation. And I kind of became aware of this when I was working on accessibility annotations for screen readers on mobile technologies. I kind of realized that there are two kinds of accessibility. There are some things that you can deal only in a contextual way, because it will really depend on the context. And there are things that you can deal on more on the component level. So it's kind of, if your organization match this pattern where you would have a design system team, they can take care of a part of the requirements within their team when they build the components. But then the feature teams have other requirements that really depends on how they use the component. Concretely, what it would mean for this alt text attribute would be that the design system team would be making sure that images have an alt attribute, or SVG a title attribute, or whatever way you decide to provide an alternative text for other sorts of visual. And then a feature team would have to document what the alternative texts for images who don't have any textual equivalent would be. And we are coming to the third part of this, which is about using the checklist. And here I gathered a couple of tips. The first one would be, don't do accessibility checks alone. Like accessibility checks, they are really kind of similar to design or code reviews. What it means is you would always have it more successfully done if you have a fresh pair of eyes. So how we do it, for instance, in our team, whenever a feature is ready for the accessibility check or needs an accessibility check, the person doing the feature would ask in our team, like, can someone do the accessibility check with me? And then we will set a meeting, usually 1 hour or something, depending on the size of the feature. And during this 1 hour, where other people can join, I think it's good to have this kind of meeting like as open sessions, so that everyone can learn if they wish to. We go through the accessibility checklist, and we discuss the different requirements aligning with the design. So usually I would, when it's me doing it, at least I would say, okay, do you have any form input or anything else, any other element? And then when the person who is kind of in charge of the feature says yes, then we take a look closer, what are the form input and what are the requirements for this kind of element. And then, yeah, we discuss whether this is matching the requirement, yes or no. Other companies also do accessibility reviews at the design stage, like the BBC, which also organize accessibility swarms at the dev stage with larger group of people. I think this is quite interesting to familiarize yourself with those other ways of doing it. And also one good question is, when do you do the accessibility checks? And for me, the answer is not just at one point of the process. So that's also what I want to highlight with these other practices of the BBC. I will have link for further references in my reference slide at the end of this presentation. The second tip I would give is document the outcome of your accessibility check. It's relevant to the reason I gave in the beginning of this talk, so it helps you track your progress, but it's not the only reason. It's also important to ensure that you have a proper handover with the dev team if you're doing this at the design stage. So it's a way to basically document. You can do it with a project management tool, or by having a handover meeting with the dev team to make sure that what you found and also what you documented are well understood by whoever is going to take care of your design next. My third tip is train people to use the checklists. Yes, because if you don't train people, they might misinterpret your requirements or the WCAG guidelines, and the outcome of the check will just be as good as the knowledge of the person performing the check. So what we do, for instance, in our project is that every new joiner has accessibility onboarding from the company first, which is more of a general accessibility onboarding. And then when they come to our project, they have a specific accessibility onboarding where we go through more through the requirements of our checklist so that the person can familiarize themselves and ask questions about them. And then when the person starts to create design and is up for doing the first check, they usually do it with me because I have this expertise that can help provide more insight or answer about the requirement. And that way the person can build some hands-on knowledge about the checklist, and then they can feel more confident to actually perform the check themselves or with other people in the team. And my fourth tip sorry, is update the checklist when necessary. So yeah, it's important that your checklist, it's a tool and it's also a living document. So if you take the example from a compliance point of view, WCAG 2.2 is on its way as I speak. So when it will be released, we would need to evaluate how the new requirement or the requirement that has been changed impact our success criterion, impact our requirements. And from a usability point of view, you could add requirements based on the outcome of usability tests. So here I can give this example of a demo that we made with Fable on our website some time ago. And I was watching the recording afterwards of this person using a screen reader. And I learned so much about how this specific person was using the screen reader. I kind of like cross-check after that with some information online. And I could already, get some hints that some things could actually become new requirements in our checklist based on that. I'm not saying that you should make requirement just based on the outcome of one usability test, but maybe when you do several, then you start to get patterns that you want to integrate to your requirement. All of those different tips, they go in one direction, which is establish processes to guide people in using the checklists. Yes, because again, your checklist is just a tool, but if you don't have any processes around it to empower it, then it would very likely be useless. Okay, we're going to the conclusion of this talk. So I have summarized this in the shape of several takeaways. The first one is an accessibility checklist is an interpretation. And be aware if you're crafting your own, prefer WCAG resources to start creating your requirements, even if it doesn't prevent you from checking how other organization translates success criterion into requirement. My second takeaway would be it mostly enforces compliance, but it can also work for usability. So that was a bit like this last example I gave with Fable and how making usability tests can also be a source of requirements. You could also call this best practices. Yeah. Third takeaway, use them to share the responsibility of accessibility in your organization, rather than using one checklist for one department that should be the only one taking care of the topic. I think, yeah, everyone should be aware and have some knowledge of the topic. Not everybody needs to be an expert, but if we manage to spread this kind of basic good practices around accessibility, I think the maturity or the the maturity of the accessibility in the company can get better. And then train your team, or they won't use it successfully or at all. So this is again, about these processes that you build around the checklist. And the final one, it's not enough to establish the topic in your company. So here I'm coming back to the quote from Sherry Bernhaber. Having an accessibility checklist will not be enough to implement accessibility practices in your organization. Is just a first step from my point of view. And yes, because they are just tools, they need process and also strategy to become really efficient. Yeah, and this concludes my talk. I'd like to thank my team and Laura Arrojo, who made the first version of our checklist that we're using, and also the Inclusive 24 team for organizing this amazing event that I learned so much about in the past year. And thank you to all of you for your attention. If you have questions or comment, you can ask them now, I guess, and you can also follow up with me on Twitter. My handle is Marion Coenon, MarionCouesnon. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marion. That was an amazingly practical and informative talk. Thank you. Roberto, do we have any questions for Marion?
Yes. Thank you, Marion. I've also loved your presentation. There is one question from the YouTube channel from Jean-Claude Giron that say, and I agree, that would be nice to have a dedicated instruction by role. But would be difficult to maintain the list, the checklist dedicated by role. But I think also is very, very important to guarantee that every role, as you say in your exposition, the content, the developer, the designer, and not only them. I think also the buyer, the people that buy products need to have some checklist for understand better how to buy, how to order accessible product. What do you think about?
Yeah, I think there are also things that exist to kind of help with this. But I guess this is also again, very much going into the range of compliance and reaching compliance. But I think some countries they kind of adapt this. So I know this VPAT from the US that I think are those way of stating the level of accessibility that you have when you want to provide tools to other entities. I think some government also use this to actually state these requirements to have accessible tools. So in Germany, we have the BITV, and then they also provide like this kind of self-assessment, and some government entities, they ask for this self-assessment in order to investigate whether the tool they're going to have will be accessible or not. So yes, I agree, and I think some countries do provide this kind of standards already. Maybe not all, though.
There are no more questions from the internet. If I can do one, so it's not a question, it's a consideration, I think. Checklists are great, are powerful, but as you say also, it's important that people don't rely only to checklists, but they need to make education and outreach about accessibility. Because if we say, for example, like in some example of the checklist, you need to put alternate text, as you say, there are different interpretations, but we need to educate people that, for example, they don't need to use only automatic testing for test accessibility for the checklist point. So it's important that they understand that the testing of the topic of the checklist need to be between using the automatic testing, but also, and a lot, making manual testing and involving also the user in the testing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think it goes a little bit to this part of the presentation where I was saying that the requirement, it doesn't have to be about the success criterion, but it can be about the practices you build around the success criterion, so that you kind of enforces this kind of practices. So maybe one of the requirements from one of the team would be test with this tool, but also test with this, or perform accessibility swarms, as they talk about in the BBC. And this would be the requirement, but then it also, like, you cannot go further without this requirement being met.
Okay, no more question from me. Thank you.
I have a question though, if I may. You mentioned design teams have a set of requirements, feature teams have another set of requirements, and later on you mentioned that accessibility is everybody's responsibility in a production team. How do you think that checklists like the UX checklist for accessibility can help teams collaborate with each other to make it work so the whole product is really joined up?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a very good point of friction in there. Like, the question is also like, how much do people who just want to make their job need to know? And that's why, you know, I think it's a complex structure, because some team or some people, they would just try to respect whatever requirement you do, and that's why I don't think that everyone needs to be aware of all the WCAG criterion. But for those kind of people, I'd say that those checklists, they are a way of like making sure that at least they respect that. But then I think also those checklists, they can be a bit restrictive, and they should also be open in a way that you're not, again, you know, restricting a responsibility solely to one team or one, yeah. So I think it would be important that, because you can catch problems at different stage of your process, right? So you don't want to leave a responsibility of a whole requirement just to one team. That's what I mean, because yeah, and one way of doing that is keeping the checklist open. Like, they shouldn't be private, I think, in a way. Like, everyone should be able to see, at least from within your organization, what are the different requirements of the different team. And then I think it's a lot of training. Like, actually, that's why I say, like, checklists can be extremely useless if they doesn't come with training, because yeah, it creates misunderstanding and
right. Yeah. And do you think it's helpful for example, you know, designers to have some understanding of the parts of the checklist that developers are responsible for, or vice versa, so they don't, without realizing it, design something that a developer can't implement accessibly? Do you think that sort of crossover is helpful in this context?
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate of designers should know how to code. So
you'll scare them.
No, yeah, yeah. I think this is also like the complexity, again, you know, of this WCAG. Sometimes it has very technical wording, and sometimes even me coming with the perspective of someone who knows some things about code, it's a bit hard to get my head around. So I think for designer, it constitutes a huge barrier as well. But yeah, I think designer also should be interested, and it doesn't have necessarily to come from the development knowledge, but just asking yourself as a designer,
Yeah, no, that makes a great deal of sense. So on that note, we are just about out of time. Everybody who is viewing, if you liked Marianne's talk, and I can't imagine that you wouldn't have done, wonderful as it was, please head over to our YouTube channel and press the like button to show your appreciation. And while you're there, why not subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to stay in touch with us for the rest of the conference and beyond. A quick reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you'll find a copy of our code of conduct linked from every page of our website. We couldn't do this without the very generous support of many organizations, including Intopia, Fable, Barrier Break, TPGI, UX for the Win, Equal Entry, InfoAxia, Intuit, the Law Office of Lainey Feingold, Adrian Roselli LLC, and WebAble. We will be back with you on the hour with our next session. In the meantime, please keep up the conversation in the YouTube chat and on Twitter. Take a quick break and we will be back with you shortly. Roberto, Mariam, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.